On the 23rd of May 2021, we welcomed Jim Forest, well-known peace activist, author and theologian, and also friend of Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, to speak to us about their friendship to the LCSB in the 6th of our LCSB50 talks. We hope that you enjoy it. So, can I say a huge welcome to everybody? My name is Adam Simon. I'm leader of the lay community of St. Benedict, and this is the 6th of our LCSB 50 talks, and we're absolutely thrilled to have Jim Forest with us tonight. And just so that everybody knows, this is being live streamed on YouTube. When it comes to questions, please put your questions in the chat, and Mike, who will be facilitating the discussion afterwards, will be able to call on you. If you don't want to actually say your question, just put it in the chat and let Mike know that. And I'm going to let Mike introduce Jim, but I think that we all ought to, before we do that, say a community happy birthday to Mike. So happy birthday, Mike.
Happy birthday, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Birthday.
And Mike, thank you so much, because it's through you that we have Jim to speak to us tonight, and we feel really honored and delighted that Jim is here with us. And I'm now going to pass over to Mike, who will introduce Jim for tonight's talk.
Well, Jim, first of all, we're so happy that you're restored to activity and able to join us this evening, and grateful that you found the time to come when I know you need to be careful with your energy and attention. And especially now I've discovered that you have a waterproof no from your book. Your life so far brings so many threads together. And it's been wonderful to discover more of the details and nuances through reading your prize-winning book, Writing Straight with Crooked Lines, which I know will be a huge resource for years to come for all kinds of people. It's clear, Jim, that you're well named. The opening psalm encourages us to be an upright tree rooted in faith. Now, you, with your crisscrossing of America by greyhounds as a teenager, early experience of homelessness, high school dropping out, enlistment in the US Navy, conscientious objection to nuclear arms, working with the homeless and Dorothy Day in the Catholic worker community, founding of an array of peace organizations, your protest against the Vietnam War to the point of imprisonment, fruitful friendship with Thich Nhat Hanh, not to mention the printer's ink that flows in your veins, your gift for photography, and then your absorption of an entirely new environment in Holland. I think that makes you very much a Forest. What shines through for me is both your ready companionship with so many well-known and obscure people, because you never stand on ceremony, and your intense practical compassion, which has invariably led you to the decisive action that inspired Merton's celebrated letter to you as a young activist feeling the heat. In all this, though, I can't forget your recall of two incidents out of the mainstream. The first was in 1951, the impact of two people who are not named, but so vividly brought to life. The two Japanese women wearing silk veils who had survived Nagasaki and had come to a New Jersey church service whilst receiving treatment from plastic surgeons. Etched in your memory, you described them as, and they are now very much in mine. And then in prison in 1969, or should we say your sabbatical, you describe how a mysterious benefactor sent you that now celebrated overview photo of the whole Earth seen from space, and how it deepened your commitment to a unified understanding of an obviously single and united Earth that's seen in that image. So I won't rabbit on, but I just wanted to at least hint at your remarkable breadth and depth of experience before you home in for us now on Dorothy and Tom. So Jim.
Well, you certainly have read my autobiography carefully. I'm very impressed. those women from Nagasaki that were in the church in 1951, I think they really were a life-changing presence.
Mm.
I remember the silk scarves they wore around their faces, so you couldn't really see their faces. They could see through the scarves. They were guests of the pastor of the church and his family for some months. It brought home to me in a way that nothing else could have the reality of war, and especially the particular horror of nuclear war. Turned my life. Well, I was nine years old, I suppose. I wonder what life I would have lived if I had never met them. Well, I didn't even meet them. I just saw them, looked at them from a distance. Well, we're going to talk tonight rather informally about Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day. Let me start by just saying something which is obvious when I look at the pictures of you on screen, how many of you have books and bookcases behind you, and me too. Books change one's life sometimes rather dramatically. One of the books that had the greatest impact on me was a book I read while I was in the Navy. In fact, there were two books that I read while I was in the Navy, both of them having to do with tonight's topic. One was Thomas Merton's autobiography, The Seven-Story Mount. The other was Dorothy Day's autobiography, The Long Loneliness. And I can't quite imagine what my life would have, what directions it might have turned if I had neglected to read one or the other book. Although I think if I'd read one, I would inevitably have read the other, because they connect with each other in so many ways. 1948, when I was just about to turn 7 years old, November 2nd, 1948, not many weeks after that birthday, Merton's Seven-Story Mountain appeared, and to the astonishment of the publisher, became a bestseller. I ran into the book when I was in a bus station in New York City, waiting to take a bus up the Hudson River to an Anglican monastery. Snow was falling, heavy snow, beautiful snow. And I remember the bus ride vividly, glancing up from the book, looking out the window of the bus, watching the snow falling through cones of light from the street lamps in towns along the way. And I don't think I doubt very much I got much sleep that night, if any. I might have spent the whole night reading, because I couldn't put it down. It was remarkable to encounter out of the blue in the newsstand of the bus station this book with a strange and elusive and obscure title, The Seven-Story Mountain, misspelled story, seemed to me, S-T-O-R-E-Y. It opened the window to monastic life, to the rule of Saint Benedict, to a life that was centered in prayer, community, hospitality. Not long after I got back to Washington, D.C., where I was stationed, I'd been trained as a meteorologist at the Navy Weather School, and I went to the U.S. Weather Bureau, now the Weather Service, for more than 2 years, about 2 years, and became involved in church life in Washington. One of the people that I didn't know about when I arrived in Washington was discovered soon after this monastic retreat that I'd taken was Dorothy Day. In the parish library, I discovered a book called The Long Loneliness. That's the other book that dramatically reshaped my idea of what I might do with the rest of my life. It became clear to me I wasn't going to be a meteorologist after all. I was going to be in some sense, either a monk or a person working in a house of hospitality. In other words, the worlds that became visible to me through Merton and through Dorothy Day. One of the surprising things in Merton's autobiography, as you may recall if you've read it, is that this book, published in 1948, a few years after the end of the Second World War, describes in some detail his surprising, remarkable, almost unheard of decision not to take part in that war as a combatant. He was ready to be a medic. He said he didn't want to do anything in his life that he couldn't imagine Christ doing. That was a startling idea for me. A life shaped by choices that you could imagine Christ making, a life shaped by choices, negative choices, things you wouldn't do because they weren't modeled by Christ. I had never, I guess I'd heard of conscientious objection, but that was the first time that it really brought home to me in so vivid a way, Merton's autobiography. And then finding Dorothy's autobiography, The Long Loneliness. Well, it was just as startling. She was far from, she was way distant from a monastic life in the usual sense of the word, living in a house where the door was open 24 hours a day, more or less literally, where anybody might come in and need urgent help, a place to stay, something to eat. Person who might be in the midst of a nervous breakdown, a person with having addiction, withdrawal symptoms, whatever. Well, these two remarkable books opened doors for me, which I'm still walking through. And in the case of both Merton and Dorothy, you found a Christianity which was not lost in national identity. It wasn't without national identity, but that was entirely secondary. The most important aspect of their lives was following Christ, literally being a Christian. And an endless exploration, of course. We never finished discovering where Christ is leading us. I doubt that even after we're dead, that the voyage will be over. Now, I'm not reading the lecture that I've given on various occasions on this topic, but I'm looking at it as we eat together. And thinking how significant the relationship was between Dorothy and Merton. I was quite surprised there was a relationship at all. I remember taking the bus from Manhattan to Staten Island with a ferry boat in the middle, of course. So rather hard to drive a bus across the body of water that separates Staten Island and Manhattan. Taking the bus from the Staten Island end of the ferry to the southern end of the island, where the Catholic worker had a farm. And I'd been asked to bring a bag of mail to Dorothy. I was up visiting from my job in the Navy, long weekend. And opening the bag, seeing Dorothy open the bag at this table where everything's centered around a pot of coffee or a pot of tea. And reading aloud the mail that had come in that particular bag. It turned out to be a custom that Dorothy often followed. Whoever happened to be around got to hear Dorothy read the mail and comment on the people who had written the particular letter, or comment on things that happened between them and the Catholic worker in earlier years. It's a kind of ongoing seminar on what the Catholic worker was all about, how it came to be, who was in it. One of the letters came from the Abbey of Gethsemane in Trappist, Kentucky. Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton, and correspondence. I was quite startled. In the 7-Story Mountain, Merton had mentioned in passing that they wrote, monks at the Abbey wrote very few letters, 4 a year, only during the festal seasons. 2 relatives, of which Merton had very few because most of his parents had died. His brother was in the military and would soon die in the war. here was Merton and Dorothy corresponding. And the letter was about civil disobedience. Merton congratulating Dorothy for having gotten arrested for refusing to take shelter during a exercise in civil defense. Everybody in New York, Manhattan, or I guess the whole city, was supposed to find shelter, hide in a basement, crawl under their desk in a schoolroom, go into the subway stations, the metro stations, the underground. And Dorothy had been arrested and sent to jail briefly for a week or two for refusing to take shelter, sitting instead on a park bench in front of City Hall with half a dozen or a dozen other people. Well, I mean, I knew that Merton had been a conscientious objector, but I didn't know he was an enthusiast for civil disobedience, and was writing to, of all people, Dorothy Day to congratulate her on her latest arrest. Not that she got arrested that often. I think 8 times in her long life she was arrested. It was surprising. And then I realized, didn't know it right away, but the correspondence that I happened to walk in on, Dorothy reading these letters, was in a way just beginning. I mean, Dorothy and Merton had started corresponding in 1948 after the publication of the 7-Story Mountain. But this was a correspondence in which they became confessors to each other. Dorothy talking with Merton about major vocational questions that she was facing, Merton doing the same. And that Merton was going to become, in the years to follow, 1960, this first letter was that I heard Dorothy read aloud, was 1961. This first letter was really where Merton's engagement with the Catholic worker became very intense. And if you happen to have a copy of it, and find somebody who has a copy of this, there's a book called The Hidden Ground of Love, which is a collection of Merton's letters to various people. I'm one of them. 50, 60 pages of the book are letters of Merton to me. Quite a number of letters to Dorothy Day. And you'll plunge into this amazing exchange of thoughts, letters, confessions, cries for help, asks, requests for prayer. I think about 2 decades into his monastic vocation, Merton writes a letter in which he mentions, as if in passing, if it hadn't been for the Catholic worker, he has no idea what he would become. But the Catholic worker had been one of the reasons, it represented an aspect of Christianity which helped to explain to himself what drew him to Christianity. If there had been no Catholic worker, he wasn't sure he would have been baptized. Now, Merton could get carried away a little bit sometimes. I sometimes point out to friends he didn't have a very good set of brakes. But you see, and he describes it so vividly in the 7-Story Mountain, the struggle it was to choose between a monastic vocation and a vocation in a house of hospitality in New York, one similar to the Catholic worker. Dorothy Doherty had come to speak at St. Bonaventure's College in Olean, New York, where he was teaching English, having graduated from Columbia. And he was so impressed by what she described, this life of hospitality in Harlem, northern part of Manhattan. that he began taking the bus to New York, no small drive, in order to become a regular volunteer. And the hardest choice he had to make in his young life was whether to devote the rest of his life to being part of that or becoming a monk. And I imagine because you're lay people in a Benedictine association, it's not a quandary unfamiliar to you. Before Merton was writing letters to Dorothy, he was sending boxes to her. Boxes of Trappist cheese, for example. Fruit cake made by the monks. I don't know if they were allowed to eat it or not. It had bourbon in it. Merton didn't quite approve of the business aspect of the Trappist life, but the abbot was trying to make ends meet. And selling fruitcake turned out to be a very good thing to do if he wanted to come to pay the bills at the end of the month. I recall a gift card tucked inside one of the boxes that came from the monastery to the Catholic worker, signed in Merton's easily recognizable handwriting, Uncle Louis, Uncle Louis. Well, of course, from his monastic name was Father Louis. It was from Uncle Louis and the boys, the novices that he was teaching at the monastery. Louis, somewhat ironic because he was Saint Louis was, of course, a major figure in the Holy Wars, the Crusades, and Merton was no great admirer of the Crusades, to put it mildly. In fact, Merton often addressed his letter, signed his letters Uncle Louis or Father Louis. And the boys, his novices, I got to know when I first visited the monastery. Well, coming to the Catholic worker out of the Navy, having gotten a discharge as a conscientious objector, one of the unexpected events was being asked by Dorothy to respond to a letter from Thomas Merton. He had sent a poem about the Holocaust, wondered if we'd like to publish it. The answer was, not surprisingly, yes. Write to Father Louis, she said, and tell him that we'll put it in the next issue, which we did. And then some weeks later, and I wrote him the little letter that Dorothy asked me to send to Merton, never expecting a response. And indeed, to that particular letter, there was no response. But the second letter was also a letter of acceptance. We've received your essay. The root of war is fear. And we will, of course, publish it in the next issue, which will be October 1961. And just thanking him for it. And to that letter, he sent me a response. And from that point on, we were in correspondence for the rest of his life. I think it's one of the striking things about Merton that he could take so seriously the letters of a young person. I was just turning 20. And begin and pursue a correspondence that lasted the rest of his life. Of course, Dorothy was much the same. She took everybody seriously. Everybody counted. Everybody was worth prayer. Everybody was worth a word, conversation, a welcome. I received an invitation from Merton to come and visit and hitchhiked to the monastery, where I was there about a week or 10 days, I suppose. And spent time every day with Merton, went to confession with Merton, sought advice, vocational advice from Merton, talked about liturgy, listened to attended his classes with the novices, and heard what he had to say about the Desert Fathers, the church in the early centuries. It was an astounding opportunity. I never ceased to be amazed and grateful. In a letter to Dorothy sent 2 days later, I've referred to this already, Merton remarked that the reason he went to Friendship House, the House of Hospitality in Harlem, rather than the Catholic worker in Lower Manhattan was because I was at Columbia, just down the hill from Harlem. And the Catholic worker, of course, was in Lower Manhattan. So it was just a question of kilometers that decided to put him in Friendship House. The Catholic worker, Merton wrote to Dorothy, is part of my life. I'm sure the world is full of people who would say the same. If there were no Catholic worker in such forms of witness, I would never have joined the Catholic Church. Well, I think that's exaggeration. He would have, but it made it a lot easier because compassion was one of the driving forces in Merton's life from an early age. So his mother was a Quaker. His father was an unchurch attending Anglican. And for both of them, the gospel meant a great deal. The church was disappointing, but the gospel was not. One of the themes in their correspondence that stands out as I reread this essay about their friendship, one of the themes was perseverance. My constant prayer, Dorothy confided to Merton just before Christmas 1959, my constant prayer is for final perseverance, to go on as I am trusting always. The Lord himself will take me by the hair of my head and set me where he wants me to be. I think perseverance is, of course, is one of the major themes of monastic life. Stability for Trappists is one of the 4 vows. Not an easy vow for Merton, probably harder than the other 3. In his response, Merton noted that his awareness that more and more one sees that perseverance is the great thing. But he also points out that perseverance is much more than hanging on to some course which we have set our minds to and refusing to let go. It can sometimes mean not hanging on, but letting go. And of course, that is terrible. But as you say so rightly, it is a question of God hanging on to us by the hair of the head, which that is from the top, on top and beyond, where we cannot see or reach. Merton was constantly thinking about a better monastery, poorer monastery, more radical monastery, a monastery offering greater solitude. The green grass was in every direction except where he was standing. And Dorothy was this, also she confessed to him in one of her letters, seeking the grace to maintain her own vocation because living at the Catholic worker was far from easy. There were many occasions when she thought seriously, maybe I've done enough. Maybe I can let the work go on to others, live a somewhat retiring life, even a kind of monastic life. When you read The Long Loneliness, you get a glimpse of this side of Dorothy. Let me wrap up the monologue part of this extremely informal talk and just point out one thing that the 2 of them had absolutely in common. I've never known 2 people who are more alike in their devotion to spiritual discipline life. When I think of Dorothy, I think of her, first of all, on her knees in one of the local churches. There were 3 or 4 local churches that she might drop into on a given day. And she kept lists of people for whom she prayed. She prayed the rosary at least once a day. She went to confession at least once a week. And it wasn't because she had nothing to confess. She we had received from Benedictines in the Middle West, St. John's, booklets for Compline, Vespers, morning prayer. And thanks to that relationship with the Benedictines, Dorothy had started a custom of us praying the hours. So those who were so inclined, you didn't have to do it, we gather together on the second floor of the house, a sort of living room-like area, and pray the hours two or three times a day. Pray the hours together. It wasn't only Merton who was living a very disciplined spiritual life, so was Dorothy Day. And I think without it, we would never have heard of her. She once said something like, if I've achieved anything in my life, it's because I wasn't afraid to talk about God. And maybe on that note, I'll stop the monologue. And I don't know how much time we have left. I have half an hour. Well, what thoughts do you have? What questions, what insights?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jim. That's such a fascinating insight into Merton and Dorothy Day and your own involvement. Thank you very much indeed. So yeah, we have about half an hour for questions. So if anybody would like to kick off, then you'll be very welcome.
Thank you, Jim, for that wonderful talk and for giving us such a personal insight into Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day. The question which I have for you is this. I have here your book, The Root of War is Fear. And in it, there's a beautiful moment when Thomas Merton is leading a retreat. And he starts off by saying, Lord, that I may see.
Oh, yes.
And so,
he did it in Latin.
Yes. Really, my question is, if Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day were around today, what would they be asking the Lord to see, do you think? And maybe we could sort of get some inspiration from them and their lives.
Well, the line comes from the gospel passage where Jesus is walking past a man who was born blind. And the man says to him begs him that he might be able to see. And Merton took these few words and talked about how everything depends on how much we see and how well we see. And that became one of the major themes of this retreat in November 1964. Really seeing. One of the participants in the retreat was a Quaker named A.J. Mussey, a very important figure in the American peace movement. And he had just had cataract surgery on both his eyes. And so it brought home dramatically as he was exclaiming all the time about what he could see, the colors, the shapes. He was just in a state he was like the man born blind. Except that, of course, he could remember seeing, but it had been a long time since he'd seen very well. So it sort of dramatized the theme of seeing things. One of the other themes of that retreat was Franz Jägerstätter, the Austrian conscientious objector, who refused to fight in Hitler's wars and was eventually beheaded in Berlin, 1943, 9th of August, 1943. And you think, how few were the people in the churches, the Christian churches of Germany and Austria, who dared to see what was really going on, what the nature of the Nazi movement was all about. When you start to see and see with spiritual perception, it is a constant challenge. Now, what Merton would be seeing today, I have no idea. Probably some of the same things he was seeing then. On the other hand, Merton was constantly in motion, always new interests, new avenues of approach, new things to see that he hadn't seen the day before. It would be very interesting. We certainly wouldn't be disappointed that he'd lost interest in the world.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. So if we haven't got another question ready, then I have one. That sabbatical of yours in prison, you shared the incarceration, I think, with a Benedictine monk.
Yes, we were 14 of us. We went into the draft board, the conscription headquarters in Milwaukee. There were 9 draft boards side by side, very convenient for us. one of the participants in the group of 14 was a Benedictine monk from Massachusetts.
And I just wondered what he went on to do afterwards. Did he go back to his, because I think he was on some kind of mission, wasn't he, in Boston, was it? And then he got involved in the peace movement.
Yeah, he got very involved in especially what would probably be called today Black Lives Matter. He was very concerned about the structural injustice that Black people of color, were subjected to, built into their lives.
Mm.
So it's an interest Merton had in common with him. To say the least, interest is putting it mildly.
Mm. Because we don't get so many English Benedictines ending up in prisons, so
You don't get them in America either. But I mean, really, most Benedictines are not called to such a thing.
No.
And Merton never ever pushed anybody into anything.
Yeah. He was slightly horrified, I think, wasn't he, that getting quite so deeply involved in kind of litigation and prison.
Yeah. Well, each Benedictine community has its own specific identity and emphases. In the case of this particular monk, the community was open to letting him explore his interest in racial injustice, housing issues, prison issues. And eventually it led to his departure from the Benedictine community, although not from his friendships with the community. I mean, he remained a kind of derobed Benedictine the rest of his life.
Interesting. Thanks.
Derobed, is it? Disrobed?
Yeah, well, exclaustrated, or I guess.
Yes.
Something like that. Yeah, but the prosecutor, was it the
Yes, one of the two prosecutors was deeply moved.
He had a transformation as well, didn't he? Yeah.
Yes, at the end of the trial, he resigned his position with the district attorney's office and decided to devote the rest of his life to what in America is often called pro bono legal services, helping the poor. And he talked about the influence of this wonderful Benedictine on his decision to reshape, redirect his life, come out of the trial.
Wow.
I've just, as you know, you have it. Is an autobiography that I've written recently, and one of the stories that I tell is a somewhat detailed account of the trial.
Yeah.
And at the end of the trial chapter, you'll find that particular story.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey. Well, there's I'm not seeing any question. If anybody is ready for a question, please come forward. I can't see you, but if you raise a hand or put something in the chat, then that would be great. Austin, yeah, go ahead. Yeah. You are muted.
Yeah, and thanks everybody. I was just in the middle of writing my question, and I thought I would answer it, ask it instead verbally, be quicker. Jim, I'm wondering whether you see the era of which you write so beautifully and remember so well, the era of Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, as a one-off, as a sort of peculiar moment of awakening of consciousness, which then, as it were, ended or came to an end or was replaced. And you look back on it with a certain nostalgia and you say, you know, the church is no longer there, the world is no longer there. Or whether you see possibly signs at the moment of what you lived through in today's, you know, church and in today's moment. That's my question.
Well, of course, the 60s was a particular intense period of artistic creativity, cultural experimentation, interest in psychedelic drugs, mind-expanding so-called drugs, interest in mysticism, alternative religion. I mean, a lot was going on. And there were quite some remarkable people who were helping to raise questions in very articulate ways that were very significant in many people's lives. But I don't think it's all in the past tense. And I think now in the looking back in the 60s and 70s, we see much along those lines happening again, only in a slightly different way, maybe more coherent. And there was an awful lot of craziness in the 60s and 70s, self-indulgence. Dorothy Day, if you know, one of the things I didn't get into in this particular talk, well, talk is over glorifying it, these informal reflections. Dorothy wasn't much impressed with the Beat Generation. You know, Merton was much kinder to it in his letters than she was in her responses. There's a lot we can learn from their mistakes as well as from their achievements. I think thanks to the anti-war movement, we haven't had a nuclear war. I think thanks to the anti-war movement, wars that did happen less destructively than they might have happened and ended sooner than they might have happened. Although in the case of the Afghanistan war, well, that seems to be permanent.
Thank you. Chris Walker, I think you were about to ask one, then I got one in the chat from.
Yes, hello there. Jim, fascinating. I've put it in the chat now. It's been a fascinating reflection on Thomas Merton and Dorothy Day. I have read little on both, and my list of books to read has grown enormously over the past few minutes, including your own.
Every author is a book salesman.
Would you tell us a bit more about the effect they had on your life? Because I don't know a great deal about your life. It'd be very interesting to hear about the effect they had on you.
Well,
in practical terms, sort of thing.
Yes. Well, they completely derailed me. I've never finished my university studies. I never finished my high school studies. I joined the Catholic Worker, and I sometimes joke I've been a student at the Dorothy Day University ever since. Never graduated. Don't see graduation in sight. I've been a newspaperman, a journalist. I've been a magazine editor. I've been a weatherman. I've been a full-time protester working for peace organizations for certain years of my life. I've led hundreds of retreats on aspects of spiritual life. I mean, I'm very interested in icons. I've written about icons. I'm very interested in the New Testament, needless to say, and I've written a great deal about that. It's all sorts of things. It's whatever comes along that looks most interesting at the time.
Mm. What about Benedict and the rule of St. Benedict? How has that?
Well, I was thinking about that today because of preparing my thoughts for this conversation tonight. I think for me, the most important thing in the Holy Rule is the hospitality. Now, that wouldn't necessarily be true for very many people, but when you think about the Holy Rule and the place that the guest is given, he or she should be received as Christ. It's quite a startling insertion. Not that it's a strange one for monks. Monks have always been associated with hospitality, but to make it something central to the identity of a monk. And in a sense, one could say to the identity of a Christian. I think we've had hundreds and hundreds of people stay in this house. It's not a big house. From all over the world. It was part of the education of our children to grow up with people from faraway places. One night we had 11 people in this little house, 6 of them from Hiroshima. And they were here for more than a day. You know, you look back on these visitors and you realize for your children, not just for yourself, how significant it is to have the opportunity of meeting people, talking with them, eating with them. Oftentimes they cook meals, eat food cooked by a guest from another part of the world, all this kind of thing. Been very important. And the Benedictine rule recognizes the importance of hospitality. Each guest should be received as Jesus Christ.
Hey, thank you. There's a couple of meaty questions coming up from Richard. What do you think that Thomas Merton would have thought of Pope Francis's pontificate?
I've been thrilled, delighted. Please be honest. You know, we often think, friends and I, when we talk about Pope Francis, saying Dorothy Day somehow became Pope. You know, really, the similarity between Pope Francis and Dorothy Day is overwhelming. The emphases, the way he puts things, the metaphors he uses, the things that he draws attention to in his books and sermons.
And he picked her out when he came to Congress in, was it 20?
Yes, 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 4 or 5, the Pope was invited to speak to both houses of Congress. And to my astonishment, I was going to say surprise, but it's more than surprise, he highlighted 4 people whom he regarded as exemplary Americans. One of them was Thomas Merton, another was Dorothy Day. There was also Martin Luther King and Abraham Lincoln. Well, it was quite a surprising speech. Members of Congress must have been scrambling once they got out of the chamber to put on their iPhones and find out who is Thomas Merton, who is Dorothy Day. I'm sure many of them had never heard of them before. Here's the Pope speaking to the leadership of the American government about Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton. Amazing.
Great, thank you. There's a interesting question picking up on Wikipedia from Liam, where it states that you became a Catholic while in the Navy, and then in 1988 you were received into the Orthodox Church.
Yes, well, I'm a Catholic on loan to the Orthodox Church.
Okay.
I've never left the Catholic Church. I couldn't possibly do that, but
Okay.
but I could. I could extend the route a little bit because I happen to love the liturgy. I love the Catholic liturgy too, but the Orthodox have changed. They've done the least messing about with the liturgy. And a lot of my work in the peace movement in the last 10 years of my work as General Secretary of the International Fellowship for Reconciliation had to do with Russia, East Bloc countries, so-called. I spent a great deal of time in Russia, wrote 2 books about the church in Russia, not only the Orthodox Church, but other churches and religious associations. So both my wife and I discovered that once we accepted an invitation to attend the liturgy as a small Orthodox parish in Amsterdam, you know, not very far from where we live, we couldn't not go. It wasn't that we wanted to leave the Catholic Church. We didn't. We had no longing to find a better, more Christian church. It doesn't exist. Every church is disappointing. But the liturgy can be something that has enormous wave-like power in your life. And we just love the way the Orthodox celebrate the liturgy. And by chance, it's happened that we ended up in the Russian segment of the Orthodox Church. But we still go to Mass from time to time. When the opportunity arrives or the occasion arrives. Scandal to some of my Orthodox friends, but not to me.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a very lovely answer. And you have a fellow Hollander asking a question, Henry. Thank you for sharing your fascinating life. Can I ask you what drew you to the Netherlands?
I was editing a magazine published by the Fellowship of Reconciliation, a significant peace group in the United States and the oldest peace group in America. I was editing Fellowship magazine for some years, and an opening came up for a new staff person to work with the international office. And that brought me to the Netherlands. That was in 1977, and I didn't realize I'd be living here for so long. I mean, I ended up a Dutch citizen. When I came here, I thought I'd be here for 2, 3, 4, surely not more than 5 years. But that was 77, 44 years ago.
Wow. Yeah.
But I mean, our children took root here. My wife is a Dutch to English translator now. We get the kind of healthcare we wouldn't have ever gotten in the United States. God knows what I, as an unemployed, or that is to say, as a freelance writer, would be how I would cope with my medical issues. So we're very lucky to be here. It wasn't a plan; it just happened.
Thank
And we like the Dutch. We like the Dutch culture, like the Dutch society, like not having to have a car, like Dutch public transportation, like so many aspects of the society. The care, the amount of care. I mean, it's a big sweeping generalization, and not everybody qualifies. The level of social care is very high. People care about each other. Lots of them. I'd say, slightly more than you'd find in the average country these days.
Jim, we've got someone here who teaches meditation and is a kind of follower of Thich Nhat Hanh, and you haven't got on to him this evening, but I just wondered if Claire, if there's anything you wanted to ask Jim while he's here about Thich Nhat Hanh.
Yeah, so yes, I'd be most interested to hear about your meetings with Thich Nhat Hanh. Certainly, yes. I haven't read a huge amount of his work, but I come across passages of his writings all the time, and have tuned into some of the talks.
Nancy, could you bring me a copy of the Thich Nhat Hanh book? Yeah, my latest book, it's just been out a few weeks, is about Thich Nhat Hanh. It's called Learning from Thich Nhat Hanh. The title is Eyes of Compassion, Learning from Thich Nhat Hanh.
Yeah. I was thinking maybe I was hearing a bit of washing up going on, and I know Thich Nhat Hanh is very strong on the mindfulness of washing the dishes.
The book begins by writing out a memory of being the person who happened to wash dishes that night at the community apartment in Paris. And I was rather annoyed. I wanted very much to participate in the conversation that was going on in the living room. And here I was with 10,000 dishes in a tiny little kitchen, and feeling rather sorry for myself. And Nhat Hanh came into the kitchen, or he couldn't quite get into it. It's not big enough. Here's the book.
Yeah.
My favorite picture of pouring tea. And he said, "Jim, why are you washing the dishes?" And I thought, oh no, here comes one of those Zen questions. It's to say that because it's my turn was certainly not good enough for a Zen answer. So I said, I'm washing the dishes to make them clean. And I thought that was slightly better, not terrific, but better. And Thich Nhat Hanh looked at me and said, or Thai as we called him, Vietnamese for teacher.
Yeah.
Thai responded, "You should wash the dishes in order to wash the dishes," which I didn't get at the time. It didn't clarify things for me very much. And he could see on my face that it was a rather, uninspired expression. And then he said something which I found extremely helpful. You should wash each dish as if it were the baby Jesus. And that was helpful. And I've been working on that one ever since.
Oh.
I think you'd enjoy the book, Eyes of Compassion. It's just out. And
Yeah.
it's I compare it favorably to a National Geographic magazine. It's got loads of photographs.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
And drawings. Here's a drawing Nhat Hanh did in my journal of what he thought hippies should wear, which is basically Vietnamese peasant clothing.
Yeah, yeah.
There are a lot of drawings by Thich Nhat Hanh, as well as my own drawings and writing. Picture of the Buddha. I did that.
Oh.
So much we can learn from Buddhism.
Yeah.
And it's very helpful. It's very simple. It's learning how to be where we are, to be in this moment, not the next moment or the last moment. There's nothing at odds with Christianity, of course, but it's just somehow it's so simple that it's been overlooked, and we end up reading books about theology of the 14th century or something like that, which is not a big help to us.
Yeah, no, it's certainly, I think I feel a bit like Paul Kitter. I'm just sort of reading his book, you know, that without Buddha, it'd be difficult to be a Christian. I sort of feel that a bit now.
Well, I think I could do all right, but I'm so grateful.
Yeah.
Nhat Hanh used to say there are two kinds of Christians, capital C Christians and lowercase c Christians. And there are two kinds of Buddhists, capital B Buddhists and lowercase b Buddhists. He said capital C Christians have a great difficulty in talking to capital B Buddhists. But lowercase c Christians and lowercase b Buddhists have no problem conversing with each other and learning from each other.
Yeah.
As you know, Merton spent several days with the Dalai Lama near the end of his life. And when you hear, the Dalai Lama has been frequently asked in questions in subsequent years, what was it like meeting Merton? What did you think of it? And the thing he usually says is, for the first time, I felt I was learning something about who Jesus is.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Jim. We've got
Thank you.
a few moments left. Sean, I think you did have a hand up. Did you want to ask a question, or was that just responding positively? Sean and Marissa.
Well, yeah, it's more comment. I run into faith groups. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
I run into faith groups, and Jim, you do sound very into faith. You sound very much on my page. If that's is that true? Are you into faith type person?
Well, I generally speaking like talking to people.
That's it. That's all it is. And listening.
And listening. It's kind of dull if it's just your side of the conversation. You know what you're going to say most of the time, not always. But you've heard that before. The person, or the other person is going to say is going to be what's interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then back to Barbara and Adam. I think Barbara's got a question.
Yes, it's just protesting for what you truly believe in and not knowing the consequences takes real courage. It takes you out of your comfort zone. So I just wondered, were you ever frightened and how did you overcome that?
Yes, of course. I remember walking to the draft boards with a priest from Boston, not the monk. And I think both of our knees were literally shaking every inch of the way. We were about to be arrested. We didn't know how many years we'd ended up serving in prison. It only turned out to be we were sentenced 2 years and served 1. But we didn't know that. We didn't know 10 was not an unlikely number. We were walking to a long stretch in prison, and who knew what was going to happen and what prison would be like and what people we would meet and how dangerous some of them might be and all that sort of anxiety. Sure, I've been terrified.
Yeah.
But I think that's, I think it's just as difficult to try to make peace as it is to try to make war. Only you're less likely to kill people if you're trying to make peace.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I think I do get a bit of time pressure here, Jim. So I think I'm due to hand back now to headquarters. But thank you so much for such fascinating answers and such a companionable way of communicating this evening. It's been absolutely delightful to hear from you. Thank you so much.
I've rarely given so unpremeditated a talk.
So on behalf of the lay community, Jim, thank you so much. We're celebrating our 50th birthday this year, and you have given us much source of inspiration with your informal discussion tonight, which was really a lovely way to deliver a speech. We felt like we were in your home. Maybe you had 53 people in your home tonight.
Well, I don't know if we've ever had 53, as many as 53, but we have had quite a number.
Yeah, and
Thank you for raising the level.
Well, and you really opened up the lives of two great luminaries of the 20th century. And I think there'll be a few people going to Amazon or wherever you buy books to deepen their knowledge about Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton.
Let me mention that two of my books are biographies of them. One of them is called All Is Grace. It's a biography of Dorothy Day.
Yeah.
And one is, and the one about Merton is called Living with Wisdom. And you, in that case, as there was an earlier edition, go for the revised edition.
Great. Thank you very much. We will definitely be looking for Jim Forest online. So thank you very, very much. You have pointed us back to Jesus, to the spiritual life, to Saint Benedict. Thank you very much for that. And just thank you for coming and spending this time with us.
It's a pleasure, especially now that my health is far from good. I see a lot of doctors and nurses these days.
Well, we'll keep you in our prayers.
Do that, please do that.
Yeah. Thank you very much. And thank you, Mike. Thank you, Mike, for leading our discussion so nicely, and that beautiful introduction that you gave, for being with us on your birthday, and for inviting Jim. Thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you so much for coming.
It was a pleasure.